You probably imagine Vikings as wild barbarians in horned helmets. You think their lives were only about raiding, drinking, and dying in glorious battles. But in truth, if you lived in their world, something as small as a torn shirt could ruin you. Your wife could divorce you, take your property, and leave you an outcast. Viking society wasn't just chaos, it was a suffocating maze of sexual rules so strict and invasive, they controlled everything from poetry to war. What follows isn't the heroic Viking tale taught in classrooms. This is the raw truth, taken directly from law codes and eyewitness accounts, about how an entire civilization was built on fear of sexual shame. A single word could destroy a man. Raga. That insult drained the color from any warrior's face. In the Viking assembly, the thing, swords gripped tighter. Everyone knew what came next. The accused had only three choices: kill his accuser immediately, accept total social death, or face outlawry. There was no fourth option. The word meant unmanly or sexually passive, but its weight was far greater. Viking law divided men into two classes, those who penetrated and those who were suspected of being penetrated. And suspicion alone was enough to strip a man of everything. The laws were brutally clear. Call someone Rager, and he could legally kill you on the spot, no trial required. But if he hesitated, even for a moment, the insult stuck. He would lose his property rights. His words became worthless in court. His children could be enslaved. All from one accusation. This constant fear poisoned Viking life. Men watched each other endlessly. Did someone stand too close? Did his voice crack in a battle cry? Did he weep at his father's funeral? Any sign of softness could spark deadly whispers. And the system's true genius? It forced men to police themselves. The sagas tell of countless murders. A man killed his closest friend over a joke about swimming together. Another murdered his cousin for saying he once wore a torn shirt that revealed his chest. Legal texts listed specific insults that demanded blood. Rager meant instant violence. Estrodin, sexually used, same result. Sorin, one who is penetrated, immediate death. These were not just insults, they were legal death sentences. Worse still, compound insults demanded double vengeance. Coleman gay-bearded Rager and Jew, they attacked both his masculinity and his age. That meant twice the bloodshed. Icelandic law books filled 16 pages with sexual insults, each tied to lethal consequences. Women weren't free of this system either. If a woman called another woman unmanly, it meant nothing. But accuse her of being too sexually willing, and the cycle of violence began. The paranoia even extended to clothing, posture, and voices. Men deepened their tones unnaturally. They practiced walking stiffly to avoid seeming soft. They grew beards to escape beardly insults. Some scarred their own faces just to look more brutal, more masculine, more safe. And the worst part? Truth didn't matter. The accusation itself was enough. Men killed their own sons when accused, just to prove their own manhood remained untarnished. This created a society where every word could be deadly. Friends murdered friends over careless jokes. Showing kindness was dangerous. Mercy itself was seen as weakness. And yet, the gods the Vikings worshipped behaved in ways that broke all of these rules. Thor's mighty hammer wasn't only a weapon, it was placed on the bride's lap during every wedding ceremony. The ritual was graphic, the heavy hammer pressed between her thighs as witnesses chanted blessings. This was not symbolic. It was divine penetration. Other gods behaved even more shockingly. Loki transformed into a mare, was mounted by a stallion, and gave birth to an 8-legged horse. Thor once wore a wedding dress to disguise himself. Odin practiced magic that required him to submit to spirits, by Viking standards, that made him Rager. Yet for mortals, doing the same thing meant death. Weddings didn't end with the hammer ritual. The whole community followed the couple into their chamber. Guests sang explicit songs, shouted instructions, even kept rhythm with drums. In some regions, the bride's mother physically guided the groom. And the next morning, the blood-stained sheets were displayed publicly, proof examined carefully. Too little blood meant she wasn't a virgin. Too much meant violence. The sheets were kept as legal documents for future disputes. Rituals went further. During harvest festivals, couples performed public sex acts in the fields to ensure fertility, children were present, and participation was mandatory. Some women were even married to statues of fertility gods. These marriages were legally binding. They had to perform sexual rituals with statues in front of the community. The same society that killed men for a soft gesture celebrated divine cross-dressing, bestiality, and public sex as sacred. The contradictions were staggering. Privacy did not exist. A Viking longhouse was one smoky room, packed with family, servants, and even livestock. Newlyweds consummated marriages within arm's reach of parents and children. Curtains were rare, walls non-existent. Everyone heard everything. And while sex wasn't shameful, doing it wrong was terrifying. Too loud, and you were showing off. Too quiet, and you were hiding something. The wrong sound could start rumors that ended in blood. Winter made it worse, 30 people trapped inside for months, listening, coughing, whispering, judging. The sagas describe the rules: never mention what you heard at night, never look someone in the eye the morning after. This was the Viking world. A world where gods shifted gender freely but mortals died for being suspected of softness. A society where kindness could kill you, where blood-stained sheets were legal records, where every conversation risked ending in death. Never speak of what you heard, no matter how unusual. One saga tells of a man who listened silently as his brother was attacked in the dark. He said nothing, because acknowledging that sounds broke an old social code. Yet the true fear was not the silence of the night but the endless judgment of society. Viking life was shaped by constant pressure to prove honest honor. Every action carried weight. Strength, courage, generosity, and even daily routines were measured by others. Inside the longhouse, privacy barely existed. Families, relatives, servants, and even children all shared the same space. Every sound, every movement, every gesture could be seen or heard. People grew up under the belief that nothing about their lives belonged only to themselves. Children quickly absorbed these lessons. By the age of 5, they had already witnessed countless examples of how adults behaved. By 10, they could easily read the unspoken rules of society, what earned respect, what brought shame, and what might lead to humiliation. Life inside the longhouse was like living on a stage, with the constant sense of being observed. Intimate relationships had to adapt to this reality. Couples relied on signals and codes, subtle gestures, quiet coughs, or even the arrangement of blankets, to communicate without words. These private languages were born out of necessity in a world without privacy. Witnesses mattered more than anyone might imagine. A man pretending to sleep could later testify in legal matters. Children who had grown up hearing everything could one day serve as witnesses in disputes about honor. The pressure was endless. In such a world, even the most personal part of life turned into a public trial. No moment of true intimacy existed, and every action risked being judged. If life inside the longhouse was suffocating, the fate of captives was even darker. Those taken in raids or sold in markets lost far more than privacy, they lost their very identity. Dublin, one of the largest Viking settlements, became a hub of human trade. Each slave market operated daily, except on Sundays, turning the suffering of others into a routine business. As the morning fog lifted, hundreds of men, women, and children were forced to stand before buyers. They were inspected like livestock, height, weight, health, and scars carefully recorded in detailed lists. The market was not secret, it was the economic engine of Viking Dublin, where nearly a third of the population lived in chains. The numbers were precise. A strong male laborer cost 12 ounces of silver. A young woman brought 15. Children under 10 were valued less but still sold if healthy. Each group had stereotypes. Slavic captives were so common their very name gave us the word Slav. Irish captives filled the Dublin markets. English and Scottish captives were also taken, each group reduced to a price tag. What made Viking slavery uniquely horrific was the total erasure of humanity. Under law, slaves were not considered people. Killing one was treated as damaging property. Their only protection was their monetary value. Families were torn apart. Children were sold away. Generations disappeared into records that listed them only as numbers. Even death offered little dignity. Many slaves were discarded in mass graves without rights. Some faced an even stranger fate. When a wealthy master died, one or more slaves could be chosen to accompany them, sometimes buried alive to serve in the afterlife. The scale was staggering. At its height, Dublin's slave market sold thousands each year. Entire bloodlines vanished. Generations lived and died nameless, remembered only as property. A few captives managed to adapt, learning Norse, adopting customs, and slowly earning freedom, but most lived harsh, short lives. They carried not only the weight of chains but also the silence of erasure, forgotten voices in a history written by their captors. These were not legends. Real men and women lived in a world where words could bring endless shame, where neighbors used insults and rumors like weapons. Humiliation itself became a form of warfare. One verse could destroy families, sparking feuds that lasted for generations. A poet named Bjorn Angier was feared across Iceland, not for his sword, but for his dangerous words. His verses about Thordis Grimsdottir ignited a blood feud that consumed two powerful clans. Her brothers struck down anyone who dared repeat the poems. Still, Bjorn kept writing, and with every stanza, more lives were lost. The law itself gave fuel to this madness. The Gragas Code strictly forbade romantic or suggestive poetry about women. The punishment was exile, making the poet an outlaw, someone who could be killed without consequence. Even a simple line praising a woman's beauty was treated as a serious crime. Consent or enjoyment did not matter, the poetry itself was forbidden. Why? Because the Vikings believed words carried magical force. Skilled poets were thought to bend reality itself with their verses. Love poetry was not just seen as description, it was believed to create emotions, stir desires, and take away free will. The more skilled the poet, the more dangerous his words became. In the eyes of Viking society, poets were living weapons, able to ruin reputations, damage honor, and spark violence. The true issue was honor. If a woman's name appeared in a love poem, she became a public figure of desire. Every listener imagined her in ways that disgraced her family. Fathers and brothers carried the shame, and the only way to restore honor was through bloodshed. Kill the poet. Silence the words. In the feud with violence. The sagas preserve many such tragedies. Gunnar Hamundarson once composed harmless-sounding verses about Helga Longlegs, comparing her hair to golden fire and her stride to that of a queen. Yet even those mild compliments triggered a feud that killed over 40 people. Helga's own husband joined the slaughter, despite privately admitting that the compliments were true. Viking poetry was dangerous not only for its subjects but also for its cleverness. The verses followed complex meters and wordplay that allowed poets to hide deeper meanings. What sounded like a farming metaphor might secretly carry scandalous suggestions. Listeners obsessed over decoding hidden meanings, fueling endless disputes. Poets knew the risks yet kept writing. Some claimed inspiration from Odin, god of poetry and madness. Others wrote out of hopeless love, even as they faced certain death. Sagas tell of poets composing their final lines while killers climbed the walls, finishing a verse as an axe came down. Sometimes, poetry was even used for revenge. If verses were written about you, you could hire another poet to answer with sharper insults. These battles of words could last for generations, with each family's poets adding new stanzas to ancestral rivalries. Attempts to control this chaos failed. Some regions banned all poetry about women, even praise for mothers or sisters. Others required poems to be reviewed by officials before being recited. Yet nothing worked, Vikings loved their verse too much to abandon it. The arrival of Christianity complicated matters. Monks introduced new poetic forms from Europe, creating hybrid styles that confused the laws. Latin Norse verses allowed hidden meanings across languages, while Christian imagery provided cover for suggestive ideas. Secret groups even formed to share banned verses, memorizing each other's work so that if one poet died, others would keep the lines alive. Entire gatherings were hunted down and killed for preserving such poetry. One of the most tragic tales is the saga of Cormac and Stangirl. Cormac loved her deeply, but her family forbade the match. He poured his passion into verses, while her relatives answered with violence, killing his friends one by one. He refused to stop. In the end, both families were destroyed. Stangirl lived miserably in a forced marriage, and Cormac died in exile, all because of poetry. But Viking society did not only regulate verse, it bound marriage itself in law and ritual that felt like battle. Newlyweds were never left in peace. On their wedding night, witnesses pressed their heirs to the thin walls, required by law to confirm the union. Fathers, uncles, and trusted friends all stood outside the chamber, listening closely. Their judgment would determine whether the marriage was valid. Failure carried enormous shame. If sounds of union were unclear, the marriage could be dissolved the next day. If they were too quick or seemed unnatural, relatives might whisper doubts. These observations were not gossip, they carried legal weight. The morning after, witnesses often examined the bed sheets for signs to confirm what had occurred. Families preserved these sheets for decades as legal evidence, ready to be brought forth in disputes. In such a society, privacy was almost impossible. Words could kill. Love could destroy. And even within marriage, life was lived under constant observation, where every action was judged and remembered for generations. But that was only the beginning. Viking traditions carried unusual practices that blended law, ritual, and public life in ways that seem almost impossible today. If a wife claimed her husband was not fulfilling his duties, she could call for witnesses to confirm her words. The man then faced a strange choice, either prove himself before others or risk losing his marriage. Such customs left lasting emotional scars. People developed rituals, charms, and prayers, hoping not to be shamed in public judgment. Women too were pressured to perform outward signs of satisfaction, as expectations weighed heavily on them. Life within these rules became a performance, where reputations could rise or fall with a single statement. Children even repeated comparisons about their parents, turning private matters into public gossip. In disputes, people might recall what they had once heard, and testimony could affect inheritance. Over time, some individuals became professional witnesses, known for judging family matters, and their voices carried great power. Families built special houses where such proof could be given, creating elaborate deceptions to protect themselves. But even stranger were the demands for reconciliation. If a marriage was troubled, families could demand that both sides demonstrate harmony in front of others, failure leading to broken households. This witness system extended into other areas of life as well. Business agreements sometimes involved symbolic rituals proving strength and loyalty. Alliances between powerful families included ceremonies meant to confirm unity, tying private life to public honor. Women were judged especially harshly. A bride's first night was closely watched, with her reactions interpreted endlessly, her reputation sealed forever. Evidence from that night might be preserved and brought up in disputes decades later, a reminder that nothing in Viking society stayed private for long. The Christian Church attempted to bend these requirements, calling them pagan excess, but compromise only shifted the burden. Instead of witnesses, couples had to describe their first night in detail before priests. Years later, even those confessions could be read aloud in court. And then came the festivals. Though a child, they first seemed like simple harvest gatherings, full of food, music, and games. Little Eric begged his parents to take him to the autumn celebration, expecting to see dancing and offerings to the gods. What he found instead shocked him, rituals that mixed entertainment with grim ceremonies. Communities gathered in great excitement, with merchants selling honey cakes, musicians preparing songs, and children running between tents. But in the center stood a platform built for sacrifices. Here the old beliefs demanded offerings, not just of animals, but of enemies captured in raids. Villages combined joy and cruelty, where children ate sweets while watching prisoners brought forward for public punishment. Crowds placed wagers on what might happen, turning suffering into a form of gambling. To them, it was not brutality, but a sacred performance, meant to honor the gods and secure a good harvest. Even as people laughed, traded goods, and celebrated marriages, cries from the ritual ground became part of the background, as ordinary as music. Sagas later described weddings held while sacrifices continued only steps away. Communities believed these ceremonies bonded them together. Elders gave advice, children joined in games that echoed the rituals, and even expectant mothers touched sacred platforms for blessings. Regional variations added to the danger for captives. One place favored hanging rituals, another drowning, while colder lands created rites involving ice. Whatever form it took, the belief remained the same, that the gods demanded struggle, and the community had to provide it. Afterwards, remains of offerings were distributed as sacred keepsakes. People wore fragments as charms or treated them as symbols of strength and fortune. For the Vikings, these were not acts of cruelty but acts of faith. They believed such offerings brought good harvests and strong families. If crops failed, people thought the rituals had been too merciful. Outsiders who condemned the practices were seen as weak or ungrateful to the gods. To children raised in this world, the lessons were clear: enemies were not human, hardship was entertainment, and loyalty to tradition meant participation in what others would call cruelty. Some captives were even kept alive until the next season, treated carefully only to be used again in future ceremonies. An entire economy grew from this: builders of ritual platforms, craftsmen of sacred tools, and leaders skilled in directing ceremonies. And for women trapped in unhappy marriages, escape was another kind of trial. Divorce was possible, but only through precise ritual words spoken in the correct places. Gudrun had practiced them 1,000 times: "I declare myself free from Thorstein Gleason." Simple words, yet Viking law demanded they be spoken in 3 exact locations with proper witnesses. If she erred even once, the wrong doorframe, the wrong timing, or the wrong witnesses, she would remain bound to the man who had harmed her. The first declaration had to be spoken at their bed, the very place where the marriage began. Thorstein, aware of this, often kept weapons nearby to frighten her from speaking. The second declaration required her to stand at the main doorway during a meal, with at least 5 adults present. To prevent this, Thorstein stopped eating at home, forcing her to wait for rare opportunities. Every step of her freedom was a battle against time, fear, and the weight of society itself. When she finally caught him at breakfast, he shoved bread into her mouth before she could finish the words. Legally, anything muffled did not count. She had to begin again. The third declaration was supposed to happen at the local assembly in front of the law speaker and the gathered people. But Thorstein could still block her attendance by saying she was needed for harvest, was unwell, or even ritually unclean. The excuses were endless, and each delay forced her to start over. It is what made Viking divorce laws so harsh. Women had rights in theory, but putting them into action was almost impossible. Yes, they could seek separation for mistreatment, lack of intimacy, or strange behavior, but the system was built like a maze to exhaust them. Many gave up after only 1 or 2 attempts. The witness rules were especially cruel. Each step required different people: family for the bed, neighbors for the doorway, community leaders for the assembly. But these witnesses often refused, fearing backlash from husbands. Some asked for payment. Others agreed but later denied what they had heard. Timing was another trap. Declarations made during certain moon phases carried more weight. Speaking on certain days was believed to bring divine favor. But since husbands managed household calendars, they could pretend ignorance of the proper time, forcing wives to wait weeks, even years. The physical risks were constant as well. Viking law allowed husbands to discipline their wives, and women often had to pursue divorce while recovering from these so-called punishments. But Gudrun had advantages. Her brothers were strong and willing to act as witnesses despite threats. Her father was wealthy enough to bribe officials for favorable scheduling. Most importantly, she knew every loophole, every technical detail, every trick in the law. On the morning of her third attempt, Thorstein changed his strategy. He invited 20 warriors to breakfast, filling the hall with armed men. He sat by the doorway, blocking it partly. He even spread honey on the threshold, hoping she'd slip and mispronounce the words. But Gudrun was ready. She spoke clearly despite the warriors coughing to drown her out. She stepped firmly over the sticky floor without stumbling. She named each witness in formal order while Thorstein's men sang loudly to disrupt her. Yet her words rang out perfectly before the right witnesses, in the right place, at the right time. I declare myself separated from Thorstein Egilson. The assembly declaration should have been easier, public, formal, and protected. But Thorstein made one more move. He accused her of theft, claiming she had taken items from the household. The law speaker had to investigate before allowing her words. These could have delayed things for months, even years, unless Gudrun could show proof of every item she owned. She had anticipated this years earlier, keeping careful records and receipts from merchants. The law speaker found no reason to delay. Standing before the assembly, bruised but unbroken, Gudrun made her final declaration. The marriage that had nearly destroyed her was over. Thorstein's face burned with rage, but law was law. It could not touch her now without punishment. She had overcome every obstacle, survived every attempt to silence her, and met every requirement. But most women bid in Gudrun. Most lacked strong families, rich fathers, or sharp legal minds. Many tried the divorce ritual once or twice, then surrendered. The very laws meant to protect them worked as traps instead. This brings us back to that smoky longhouse, where Hallgerd was about to demonstrate the strange power of Viking marital rules. The air was heavy with smoke, but the silence was heavier. Her words echoed above, he dresses like a woman, showing his chest like a nurse. Her husband, Thorvald, froze as the meaning sank in the torn shirt he had dismissed that morning had just cost him everything. The witnesses shifted uneasily, already calculating the social fallout. Thorvald's brother stepped back, creating distance. His trading partners looked away, knowing contracts were now void. Even his elderly mother turned aside. The rejection was complete. Olgard wasn't finished. She pointed to each witness, naming them formally for the record. Bjorn Aronside saw the shirt. Astrid Thor's daughter witnessed it. Gani, the law speaker, observed it. Each name was another nail in Thorvald's social coffin. None could deny it without risking punishment themselves. Property division began at once. Olgard claimed her dowry and her morning gift. And she was prepared. She even brought witnesses to prove that this was not the first torn shirt incident, showing a pattern. Thorvald couldn't defend himself. He had entered the longhouse a wealthy farmer. He left with barely enough to survive the winter. But the real damage was social. His sisters now had no marriage prospects, his nephews lost apprenticeships, and his name became a warning told to children about the dangers of dishonor. By evening, friends avoided him in the street. The blacksmith refused him service. The tavern keeper pushed him out. Even beggars refused his coins. Viking society had perfected social death, and Thorvald was now living it. Olgard, on the other hand, emerged transformed. No longer just another farmer's wife, she was now seen as a master of marital law. Women sought her advice. Men treated her with caution. Anyone who could use a torn shirt as a weapon was dangerous. She had used the system that once oppressed her to break free, and everyone knew it. The longhouse itself seemed changed, the same place that once hosted dull hearings now crackled with possibility. If a collarbone could end a marriage, what other secrets might the law hide? People began studying codes more closely, searching for new ways to use technicalities in their favor. This single moment, strange to modern minds, revealed everything about Viking family customs. A culture that praised shape-shifting gods but shamed men for soft voices. That demanded witnesses for marriage acts but outlawed love poetry. That allowed strange double standards in daily life. Every contradiction, every harsh rule, every impossible demand came together in Olgard's victory. Viking society had built a system where intimacy was controlled by law, where emotions were turned into weapons, and where even the smallest act could destroy a life. Archaeology still uncovers evidence, marked bones, ritual platforms, burial sites that confirm the sagas barely scratched the surface. The full truth may never be known, but perhaps the most chilling part is how ordinary it all seemed at the time. Children grew up thinking this was normal. Festivals, rituals, and customs all shaped around these strange rules. In the end, Thorvald left in disgrace, stumbling into exile. Hallgerd stood tall, having beaten the system at its own game. And Viking society marched on, where showing your chest could ruin you, but harsher practices were accepted without question.